Alrighty. So let's roll in here. Okay. Yeah, let's get cracking. So, guys and girls, everything in between, we are rolling for how to program for your powerlifting meet. So we're going to be talking about three main things that you should be changing in your programming as you go into either your first or this could be your 10th powerlifting meet. We'll start out. Let's pull up a whiteboard here because cool like that. And so we'll start out with some really basic ones here. So I have my text tools on. Oh my goodness. Okay. Guys, give me 2 seconds. Zoom has become my best friend. All right, there we go. Let's do this. Cool. So number one is sport form days. So what are sport form days? Sport form days are basically days to squat, bench, and deadlift with some heavy singles in the same day, right? It seems, kind of obvious to do this, but you'd be surprised at how many people end up skipping this tool. And so basically SBD days, practicing heavy singles. And the reason this is important is one, if it's your first meet, you don't really have any data to know how well your deadlift does after some heavier squatting and vice versa, and just overall how your energy will hold up over the course of a day. So to let you plan out your attempts. This can be as simple as just having some, 90% plus singles in your, one day a week. It can be as complicated as, going through 9 attempts for the day, 9 attempts over 3 lifts, right? So that'd be number one, is including sport form days. And if any of you have questions as we're going here, you can just drop them into the chat and I'll answer them when it's a good time. So there we go. All right. So number two is practicing singles, right? So this bleeds in a little bit into sport form days. I don't think everybody has to do sport form days, but if it's your first meet, you definitely should. But number two is singles, right? So with this, you would want to put it on your overload day. So every 1 to 2 weeks, or whenever you're programming your heavy session, you'd want to include some singles with commands, preferably, but just making sure that you're practicing that idea of setting up and having your best rep be your first rep, right? So in terms of practicing singles, again, I'm a fan of starting kind of 85 to 90%, building over the course of a block. And really, your singles don't have to be maximal to start. I think at the end of the day, singles are going to be a good way to demonstrate your strength, but reps are really how you're going to build strength. So, having your focus still be on PRing doubles, PRing triples in a peaking block is going to be very, very important. But then using singles as a way to build confidence and proficiency with those heavier loads. Yeah, so make sure they move generally fairly smooth, and then overload on 2 to 3 rep sets. Somebody will probably have a problem with this, and that's fine. But, there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat. Third point, and I think this is really the one that most people might not have incorporated into their training yet, is shifting around how many heavy and medium sessions and they're doing in a week, and then translating that from heavy and medium to overload and recovery sessions, right? So we'll paint an example here. So we'll go into a different text box and so we'll go here. So let's say your strength block, you have, let's say, heavy squats on Mondays, and then normally you would do, some kind of a secondary or medium squat on a Friday, let's say, right? We'll use one lift just to illustrate the point here, right? So the idea with this might be, work up to a 3 rep max. And then on Friday, you would do pause squats at, sets of 6 at a, 8 RPE, right? So fairly straightforward setup here. This is obviously the day you're really pushing, and then this you're pushing a different kind of squat, but because of the nature of the lift, the weights aren't going to be as heavy, right? So for a strength block, this is really, really a fairly standard generic way to program it, right? If you're going into a peak block and getting closer to a meet, those overload sessions are going to be much more taxing. And typically you've got less room to progress on other things, right? So in your strength block, you're working on, pushing progression in your heavy squats, but at the same time, you're also working on pushing a lot of progression in your pause squats as well, right? And basically trying to get a lot of things going on. Why has my video done this? There we go. All right, cool. So you're trying to get just lots going on. Instead, what you can do is in your peaking block, you would still have your heavy squat on Monday. And so let's say 2 rep max or something like that. But then in your medium day, right? Or what would have been your medium day. So for your Friday squat workout, you would program a more recovery based session. So with this might end up being something to the tune of 70% of your max for some triples, something that would be very underwhelming for a normal session, right? So 70% of 1 rep max by 3 by 4 sets or something, right? The specifics of this on how many reps and sets and stuff, don't get too caught up in this. This is pretty individual, but the idea of it being, fairly submaximal, fairly low volume, and really not at a very challenging intensity, but the specificity is high because you're doing another squat session again, right? So you get the idea. So with that, as we add in the heavier stuff, especially the closer you get to a meet, the more it really matters on how much you're managing the recovery and trying to push less. I hope that makes sense. So again, shifting your heavy and medium type setup where you might have another lift that you're working on pushing as a sort of way to bridge the gap between heavy squat sessions and really bring the specificity up and train your squat more often with less variation. And then at the same time, manage recovery a little bit better, give yourself more room and more time to recover by not trying to PR in some way on that second squat session of the week, right? Again, you can compress or expand these timelines based on your recovery, right? If you're doing a heavy squat every other week, you're going to have probably a couple squat sessions in between that single heavy squat session, as opposed to if you're doing an overload session every 4 or 5 days, you're probably going to be able to space that out and go with a little bit of a different pacing. But that idea of what would have been a medium session, replacing some or all of those with a light session is a great place to start. Does anyone have any questions about peaking blocks or powerlifting programming in general? You can pop them in the chat, or we're a small enough group today, you can just invite yourself onto the video. That's fair game as well. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions. If there's any that come through, cool. One other thing that I would add, and this is, I think more experienced lifters do this just because they see it happen more. But some people going to their first or second meet don't do this, and it makes a really big difference. Is that you should hire a handler, or you should at least have somebody handing in your attempts, if nothing else, right? And the reason for that being, your first couple meets, you've got a lot of stuff coming at you, right? There's attempts you got to give in, you got to time warm-ups, you got to time your warm-ups around the flight that's going before you. You've got to be able to troubleshoot and adjust your openers. And if you're running around like a chicken with your head cut off in the back of the warm-up room trying to get all this stuff done, I mean, you're probably not even going to warm up, right? So having a handler, if it's your first couple meets, I'd really, really recommend it. It's not, taking the easy way out, or, it's not like you should be trying to do all these things yourself. There's there's just there's no real benefit to not having a handler. You're putting yourself at a significant disadvantage. So either your coach, if they're able to come in and do that in person, awesome. Otherwise, if you have a training partner that you train with and they have experience competing in the federation that you're going to compete in, that's a really good person to handle you. They know kind of how you lift, they'll understand your mental state and all of that. And then as kind of a third option, it's not bad, it's better than nothing, is hiring a local coach for the day and having them handle you. If there's somebody that's at the meet, sending them some footage beforehand and saying, hey, you know what, I'd love to have you handle me and deal with my warm-ups and attempts and so on. Okay, we do have a question from Mike. Mike asks how a peak block would differ for a beginner versus an intermediate lifter. So quite a lot, actually. I think for most beginner lifters, and we'll put beginner in the context of powerlifting here, right? So you've probably been training for like a year, 2 years, and you're going to do your first powerlifting meet. Let me know if I'm off base with this or if I'm misinterpreting the question, Mike. I generally don't actually run a peak for these types of lifters, and it's the reason for this is just simply opportunity cost. Over the course of a peak, the objectives aren't really about getting stronger per se, but instead they're about increasing efficiency and technical precision with heavy weights. Because the volumes are so low in a peak, most lifters will actually detrain a little bit if they run a peak for any extended period of time, which is why they tend to be quite short. And so a beginner power lifter, somebody doing their first meet with a couple years of lifting experience, can probably do fine with taking a couple days of light sessions before the meet and then a couple additional days off beforehand, so 4 or 5 days of just sort of lighter stuff, and practicing with some heavy singles, practicing with met speedy days, but not running a full peak type cycle where there's dedicated light sessions and all the other things we've mentioned. And the reason for this is you can kind of continue to move that needle forward, right? You can keep getting stronger over those 4, 6, 8 weeks that you're peaking or comp prep, I suppose, for the beginner. Whereas they might get a little stronger, but not that much stronger if you were to do a full on peak cycle. And that, accounts for how much stronger somebody would be after a full taper and all that as well. On the other hand, an intermediate lifter is somebody that I think there's a lot more merit to doing a peak. They have the mechanical efficiency and the nervous system capacity, I suppose, to where running a proper peak where you're doing dedicated heavy singles and deliberately reducing volume quite significantly, and then following that up with a proper taper and deload strategy is going to yield some better benefits there. So taper and deload depends on the lifter, but for kind of your average person, average weight class, average intermediate level of strength, typically you can expect about 10 to 12 days before the meet, having your heaviest lifts around there, and then working on gradually bringing volume down to about 50% of normal training volumes about 5 days out, and having the last couple sessions be really quite light. And for most intermediate lifters, again, these are vague generalizations, but I like to have the heaviest bench around 5 to 7 days out, heaviest squat about 7 to 9 days out, and heaviest deadlift about 7 to 10 or 7 to 12 days out. Depends on the lifter, but as sort of some broad strokes there. Another question that we've got is from C. She says, is programming for a peak affected at all by the absolute weight of an athlete's lifts? Yeah, absolutely. So there's quite a few factors we actually want to look at when we're training a lifter and writing out a peak, or even just looking at assessing somebody's training cycle, right? So we want to look at their absolute age, right? So if you're 30 years old, 30 years, right? So that'd be number one. Number two is training age. So how many years you've actually been training consistently and seriously for. Then your absolute level of strength would come into that. How well you recover, right? So is your sleep good? Are you in a caloric deficit or a surplus, or are you just inconsistent with it, right? And then the other thing that we'd look at is just body weight. And I think I mentioned absolute strength a second ago. So basically, if you're a larger person, there's just more mass, right? And it takes longer to recover, right? those are kind of the broad categories. Typically, you know, the older you are, the higher your training age is, the higher the absolute strength value is. So, you know, hypothetically, you're closer to your genetic potential. The less optimal your diet is, less optimal your sleep is, the higher your stress levels are outside the gym, the more that's going to slow down recovery to where we have to space out overload sessions, and sort of the window between how much you can maximally recover from in terms of like total training volumes and how little you can train and not detrain, it will kind of narrow. So really, the weaker you are, the lighter you are, the smaller you are, the younger you are, the better you sleep, the better you eat, the more that window broadens, and it really gives you a lot more buffer to continue to get stronger, right? These are theoretical figures, but they're completely valid. Okay. Got one more question here, and then I think we'll start to wrap up. Mike asks, is missing lifts 2 to 3 weeks before competition part of the process or a sign of over fatigue? I think it's something where it's worth taking note of, but it's not worth putting too much weight into. So peaks are a funny animal. We'll put it that way. So there's one meet prep that stands out to me in my head. So it was this would have been 5 or 6 years ago for me. So my best deadlift prior to this meet, I'd pulled 518, 523. I don't remember the exact. It was within 5 pounds of there. It was sort of low 500s, and I missed 485 like 5 weeks out, and I was freaking out, obviously, right? Because I'm 50 pounds off, like 40 pounds off. This is not a great. This doesn't bode well, and I'm not even peaking at this point. Like I'm just starting to peak. And I mean, I didn't really change anything. I just kept going in with the strategy that we knew worked. And I ended up pulling 551 with like 5 kilos in the tank. So I could have pulled 562 that day. And so would I adjust what my, percentages that I'd prescribed at 5 weeks out on the next peak? Yeah, totally. But sometimes missing lifts is just a data point and you don't have to read into it too much. Of course, if everything's been going really well and then you hit the wall and you feel like you're dying 2 weeks out and everything goes to shit right before you were supposed to taper, you're probably a little off with your timing. And you probably pushed a bit too hard, a bit too soon. With that said, I haven't come into some situations like that before, or I've come into situations like that before where we can generally just shift gears, adjust our taper strategy a little bit, and we can come out with a pretty good peak still. You just have to be paying attention to anything. Okay, so I think that's it. One thing I did want to mention before we wrap up today is I've recently hired a virtual assistant to just take care of a lot of my admin duties. And so what that's done is it's freed up more room for me to be coaching, right? So I'll be opening up access for this later this week for lifters, but basically I've got 5 spots open for May. If there's any of you who are watching this replay that are interested in working with my team and I on getting stronger and I'm a beast in powerlifting, basically. So if you mention this training when you reach out, you'll get priority access into those coaching spots if you're interested. So all you have to do is just mention the training on powerlifting peaking and send me a quick DM or an email for matt@strongerupt.com and just mention the peaking training, and I'll get in touch with you and see if you'd be a good fit, see if we'd work well together. Gang, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure tonight, and see you on the next training. Otherwise, if you're interested in working together with my team and I, shoot me a quick message on Facebook or Instagram @StrongerUPT or my email, matt@strongerupt.com. Thanks. Talk soon. Bye-bye.